Hey family, welcome to How Love Works, where I share again the principles for lasting love. We're going to do a little something different tonight. What I want to share with you is something I want to direct kind of toward the men. I've been kind of hitting the women kind of hard here lately, and so I want to kind of turn in a different direction. I'm going to stick with what I started with, though. This was just something that kind of got laid on my spirit, and I wanted to discuss the issue before it kind of became an issue for me, as it were. And so last time we talked about why is it that so many women's relationships end up as epic failures. And I talked initially about mindset, and I have about 6 other areas to deal with on that subject matter because the fact that it's so comprehensive. But today we're going to be talking about certain issues regarding men. And so the area I want to deal with today is, why is it that so many Christian men do not marry? Why is it that so many Christian men do not marry? I know that's kind of puzzling for a lot of women because of the fact that when you go to your average church, it's predominantly women and children, and pretty much the leadership is about all the masculinity you're going to see in the church. I recognize that, I understand it. That's not true of all the churches because we have our share of mega churches out there. But even with that, even though you may have some churches that have quite a few men in those churches, you will find that a large number of those men are still single. And so that's kind of confusing for a lot of women that are Christian, and I understand that. So as a married man myself, having the privilege as well as the opportunity and access to talk to a lot of single men, and I've been in church for quite a few years, I've been puzzled by this myself. And I've come away with a couple of conclusions that these are just my conclusions. These are not conclusions that I kind of pulled out of a book somewhere. And so I could be off. I'm just going to keep it real. I could be off. I might be wrong. And I'm open for criticism on that one. I don't know about this. This is just my take on the issue. I realize that there are a lot of women who have really been seriously upset by some of the behavior they've had to deal with men who claim to be Christian. They have not behaved as such in many ways, and there could be a lot of reasons behind that. I don't know what their particular situation was. The woman may not have been what she represented, and it's obvious he may not have been what he represented. No one really knows. I have seen some relationships that have gone off the rails because neither party was willing to be authentic, nor would they behave like Christians. And so the result is that it never ended up as a commitment, and they never got to the point where they were able to be a representation for Christ. I mean, I recognize that a lot of people will say that you don't have to be married to represent Christ, and I would agree with that. I'm just saying that in the Bible does make some pretty profound statements about marriage, and I'm not going to go into that. And I'm not saying that a married person is superior than a single person. I don't want to get into that debate because there is no debate there. All people are, in my view, valued by God, and they all have their specific giftings by God. So I'm just talking about marriage in general for single men who have not pulled the trigger, and that's really what I'm going to deal with. And so my issue here is, what are the 2 areas that most men seem to be struggling with when it comes to this issue of marriage? And I found out that there are just 2 areas. it's about fear. Men are terrified. And the second one is just fun. They're not really ready to give it up. And so I'm going to deal with the area of fun first. For a lot of Christian men, not all obviously, I'm not trying to make a blanket statement. This is not true of all Christian men. I think it's more true of men who claim to be Christian and they're in the church playing games. That's not true of all, obviously, but that's just some of the dynamic that I see in the church, because a lot of Christian women, real women of God, have been taken advantage of by men who have been wolves in sheep's clothing, which the Bible said beware of. You would find these individuals in the midst of the church family. So, and they don't just come in male sheep's clothing, wolf, as a wolf in sheep's clothing, but they also come also as females. So with that being said, one of the problems that men in the church are experiencing with getting married is that, number one, there's a high supply of sex right now in the culture, a very high supply. Porno is everywhere. I'm just going to keep it real. Porno is everywhere. If you have a cell phone, you have access to porno. If you have a cell phone, you have access to women that you don't even know, that you can just contact, and you can set up rendezvous with just for hookups. And no one needs to know. But it doesn't matter if you're a single man. Number two, you got 1,500 single websites, dating websites, and sadly, a lot of men and a lot of women, not as many women, but a lot of men and women, they kind of use those sites as hookup sites more than anything. And I know there are a lot of sites out there, or a couple of sites, I'll put it that way, that have been instrumental in helping people come together and form bonds and turn them into lifelong marriages. I recognize that as well. But by and large, what you're seeing is there is such a high supply of sex out there, there's no need for a man to have a relationship like marriage just for that reason. Because traditional relationships, that was one of the reasons why men would have to marry, because it was virtually impossible within the society at large, unless you went to some of the seedier areas, to find women who were willing to have intercourse with you. It was almost impossible. You had to make a commitment. That's no longer the issue. The culture has totally changed. So that's one of the areas right there. The other one is men have total freedom now. Absolute freedom. They don't even have to grow up anymore. It used to be when I was younger, there was stages in a man's life. And the stages represented, where he was toward the ultimate level of manhood. And the first stage might be, he's in his adolescent phase, he's learning different things. In the second stage, he's starting to focus on building. And then the third stage, he had to determine whether or not he wanted to be a builder, a solo builder, or did he want a partner to build with. And most men saw that it was more advantageous to have a partner to build with, because it was more efficient. And it was a lot more fun, to be honest. And then of course a man would build from that level. And that was, in a sense, when a man came into the arena of marriage, then it was understood that he was a man because of the tremendous respect that was there. Okay, and beyond. That is beyond the bounds of the conversation that I'm having right now. But nowadays, that's kind of changed again. Like I said, the culture has changed. And so now guys don't seem to go through those stages anymore. Now what they're doing is from the time they're born up in, it's all the way up into their 30s now. It's called, I call it protracted adolescence, where they're living like Peter Pan. They're still living in their mama's basement. They're still living off of women, whether they're living off their mamas or they're living off they're cohabitating, living off the girlfriend, or they're living off an older woman, a cougar. They're always living off of women. And they're playing their video games, they're staying up all night watching porn, whatever the issue is. Now, that's a small segment, obviously, of the male population, but it's enough to cause problems in the church. And so this is what a lot of men are involved in a lot of times. So that's why, marriage is something that eludes them. It's not something that they even consider. Now, that's the area of fun. Now, here's the more scarier part. This is the area of fear. This is the thing that frightens men to death. This is one of the biggest reasons why men just won't make the jump. They will not jump the broom. The first reason is because men are just terrified of the modern woman. Just terrified. Absolutely terrified. And it's not that they're physically afraid of being harmed by her. It's not that. The fear comes from what they see on a daily. I mean, I see it myself when I read some of the comments. I mean, some people are mad just to be mad. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter. They start out mad, they end up mad. And so a lot of young Christian brothers, or middle-aged, I guess what I call middle-aged, 30, 35, paranoid. Because these women, they know some of the statistics. And the statistics are just absolutely crazy. 80% of all the divorces are unilateral. One person files. And 75% of that filing is done by women. Now, that's alarming. 3/4 of all divorces are done by women or initiated by women. Now, before anybody starts throwing rocks at me, I'm not blaming the women. I don't care. I'm just reporting information. The thing that's alarming to me is why they're doing it. Because when I first read the stat, I was looking for abuse. And I know some of it was, some of the reasons that they filed was because of abuse. I was looking for adultery. I knew that probably was one of the reasons as well. But what really shocked me was the vast majority, over 50% of the reasons why women file divorce is because they were unhappy. Now, a lot of women got married because they wanted to be happy. They thought that marriage had some power or something and they would be happy. And after so many years or in the relationship, I guess the two people grew apart and that was enough reason to get divorced. I've been married long enough, as you guys know, that there were many times where I was not a very happy camper. And I've been married long enough where my wife could say the same thing. I didn't really make her happy, nor did she make me happy. But we made a commitment. And you don't change your mind just because it ain't going well for you. There was no abuse on my side. There was no abuse from her side. But we were not always happy. That's just real. And so that's one of the things that just frightens men to death. Another thing is that really messes men's minds up is that they can lose everything they work for because of the way the system is. This is not true of all women, but there have been some women who recognize how the system is and they've taken full advantage of it. And men have been wiped out. But, as I said, this is not true that all men are necessarily victims here. I'm not stating that. I'm just stating the facts that these are some of the reasons why men are not so quick to jump into marriage. Okay? Another reason, and probably the last one concerning fear, is that men sometimes they end up in the penal system. I've had two brothers that ended up in the penal system. They were not even married. They didn't pay child support. Not a good thing. But, you know, I'm just saying. Sometimes men are actually put into the penal system and they've been lied on. Nothing happens to the people who lie, but that's the way the system is. I don't have to like it. It's just the way it is. So that's one of the biggest reasons. Men are just terrified of women. They'll sleep with them, but that's probably where it is. It'll end right there. I guess the second one is marriage doesn't make sense anymore for men. It just doesn't. Men, when they think about marriage, they see it as losing their identity. When they come into a marriage, they know their words don't mean anything anymore, especially if they're not the kind of man that's an aggressive man, slapping a woman around if she doesn't pay attention and all of this. If he's not that kind of guy, you know, but I don't mean a mousy kind of guy either, but I'm just a reasonable man. I'm going to tell you right now, a man loses his masculine identity. He kind of loses his manhood because he recognizes that he's going to get castrated in marriage, or he's going to be emasculated, and he volunteered for it. And so a lot of men, they see this characterized in a lot of relationships, and they're not volunteering for it. Now, is that true of all marriages? Obviously not. But that's what they see and that's what they think. So that's one of the other reasons why a lot of Christian men are not jumping into marriage. And I guess the last one, and I'll end on this, is that men have basically bought the lie that the church has been telling them and that the culture has been telling them. The church has been telling Christian men that there is such a thing as the gift of singleness. And so a lot of men have convinced themselves that they've had the gift of singleness. Now really what Paul is referring to is the gift of celibacy, but if you read the chapter that a lot of people refer to as 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he's dealing with an issue in the church where he was counseling the church in Corinth not to marry at a specific time where there was a lot of persecution of the church, and it didn't make sense for them to get married at that point if there was a lot of persecution, because a man would be concerned about his family, obviously, and vice versa, a woman. So he was suggesting that it might be better to wait or postpone marriage up until that persecution subsided. So that was the real issue. And besides, if you had the gift of singleness, I would think a component gift that would help you with the gift of singleness would be the gift of celibacy, meaning you would not have any desire. You'd be almost asexual. There would be no desire for you to have sex. There would be no desire. You wouldn't have a problem being around a person of the opposite sex. But obviously, you don't have the gift of singleness. And you don't have the gift of celibacy because it is a struggle. That is an indicator right there. So that's what the church is telling people. And I personally believe it. That to me, it's a travesty. And I think that we need to do something about that because a lot of women are being defrauded husbands as a result of that philosophy, because it's not biblical in my view. And I think it's a philosophy that is a church political correctness is what it is to me, because there are so many single women in the church. They had to come up with something that sounded good to the ears, that justified why there were not a lot of men in the church, and even more so, not as many getting married to women in the church. So they had to come up with something that people would buy, and that sounded good. Okay, the second thing that the culture deals with, and the lie that they're telling men, is that we recognize there is a war on men and boys in this culture, in Western culture, because of feminism. And anything masculine in the hands of men is a bad thing. Even though feminism itself and feminists, they actually celebrate masculinity. They like the attributes of masculinity as long as they have it, as long as they exercise it. In other words, the attributes of masculinity are things like productivity, control, power. They like that. Judgment, structure, provision. They like that as long as they're exercising it. In the hands of men, it's like a weapon. Men can't handle it, even though we're naturally masculine because of testosterone. Okay? Even though women have testosterone, but they're not, their dominant hormone is estrogen and progesterone, but that's another subject for another time. Anyway, that is what men have adopted. They believe that they are worthless as far as the society. They have nothing to offer. Why get married? I have nothing to offer, nothing that a woman would want. Ever since I was a boy, I've heard people who I love say, we don't need men. I've heard it. I've heard it in classrooms because all my teachers were female. I've heard it in college because most of my professors were female. I've heard it in elementary school, all my teachers were female. I've heard it in middle school. I've heard it from girls. So if you hear something long enough, even if it's not the truth, if you hear a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. And then after a while, you start believing it. Well, I'm not worth it. What's the point? So the church is telling men something that's crazy, and the culture is telling men something that's crazy. Now you have unintended consequences. Nobody's getting married. Men are paranoid. They're afraid to get married at the end of the day. And women are pretty much PO'd because they can't get married like they would like to. And there are some good ones out here. They're very difficult to find, but they're out here. So I just wanted to speak on that and give you something to think about. That's what I've seen. That's what I've experienced with men. So once again, thank you for your time. I'll catch you on this other side. God bless.